Last time we had Grand Rapids personal injury attorney Tom Sinas from Sinas & Dramus Law Firm, our sponsor, in the studio. He covered the basics of personal injury law and the process of hiring a lawyer to handle those claims. Today we're going to get specific and talk about motor vehicle crashes. They unfortunately happen every day and in some cases result in serious injuries. That leads to personal injury claims. But for injuries to be eligible, they have to meet a certain standard known as a threshold injury law. Okay, so Tom, thanks for being here with us today. You know, we all know about crashes. Unfortunately, many of us have been involved in them. So what exactly is the threshold injury law? What does that mean for those of us that don't speak law?
It's a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
It's a mouthful, and it's not a word you would think of as existing in a set of legal rules. So let's take a step back and ask, why do we have this concept before we understand what it is? Last time we talked about the general idea that when someone's involved in a car crash in Michigan, there are certain what we call no-fault benefits, certain things that people can access regardless of fault. We talked about medical expenses, lost wages, those type of things. In Michigan, you get those generally from your own insurance company, and again, regardless of fault. That's why we call them no-fault benefits. Well, when the system was created in the 1970s, there was a trade-off built into the law. And the trade-off was, okay, in exchange for being able to get those benefits, regardless of fault, we're going to limit the circumstances when you can pursue a claim or sue the person who caused the crash. We call that a liability claim. So the law imposed some limitations on a liability claim, and one of them was the idea that the victim has to prove that they have a certain type of injury. This is a threshold injury. The idea being that the victim either crosses or doesn't cross the threshold. If they do cross the threshold, then they can pursue a claim against the at-fault driver, primarily a claim for the change in their quality of life. If they don't cross the threshold, even though the other person may be entirely at fault, then there is no liability claim. And that concept of a threshold injury was designed at least to be a balance between the idea that people get certain benefits in Michigan regardless of fault.
So then my next question is, which type of injuries meet or exceed that threshold?
You would think that maybe you could go to a book and look up a list of injuries, but it doesn't work that way. We have categories of threshold injuries, and there's only 3 categories, and they're defined by words, not by specific anatomical descriptions. So the 3 categories are: first, death. Death is a threshold injury. The second is permanent serious disfigurement. If somebody has disfiguring wounds, typically scars or burn wounds, those are threshold injuries. But the third category is the most common, and it is called serious impairment of body function. Most common meaning, if you take a look at everyone involved in a car crash, the most common type of injury that their case falls into is a serious impairment of body function. So what's that, right? Part of the challenge here is, like, words mean more words. So the concept of a serious impairment of body function is something we could talk about forever, but people should understand sort of 3 basic concepts. The first, the victim has to have what's called an objectively manifested impairment. That's just a clunky word for the idea that it's an impairment that someone else could see. If we were sitting across from each other and I had an injury in an auto crash, there's some type of impairment that you could perceive from me, or my doctors could perceive. Number 2, has to be an impairment of an important body function. This is really kind of not a serious issue because pretty much everyone agrees that every part of their body is important. But number 3 is the victim has to show that that impairment is something that has affected their general ability to lead their normal life. General ability to lead their normal life. That means that you are required to look at the victim's life before the crash and the victim's life after the crash and be able to engage in a meaningful compare and contrast. Be able to show how certain parts of that person's life have changed, how they go about living their life have changed. And if those conditions are satisfied, those 3 parts, then you've established a serious impairment of body function, which is a threshold injury.
So what I'm kind of gathering here is this is not a one-size-fits-all, so let's not make assumptions about our injuries.
That's a great point. Oftentimes I'll encounter people who say, well, this and this happened to me and I have just assumed I don't have a threshold injury. Don't assume that. You don't need to assume for certain that you do, but you need to reach out and get some more information. I mean, there are lawyers like me. We offer free consultations for people who call, and that's why we offer this service, so that people don't have to just sort of guess. Because this is a category, you put it best, one size does not fit all. Every case is different, and so people, when they're trying to decide about their legal rights, they shouldn't make assumptions one way or another without gathering some more information, only because you may assume something that may not be correct. And this area of threshold law is changing all the time. These basic concepts stay the same, but how these concepts are defined on a case-by-case basis is always changing within our appellate courts.
And what's the best way to get in contact with you or your team? The great news is you guys have offices across the state.
All across the state, so they can find us online at www.sinasdramus.com. In West Michigan, they can call us at our local number, 616-301-3333. They can shoot us an email at info@sinasdramus.com, or our intake department, intake@sinasdramus.com. All that's on our website as well.
Awesome. Tom, thanks so much for stopping by and really breaking this down for us.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
And this segment is sponsored by Sinas Dramus Law Firm. We'll be right back with much more 8 West. Don't go away.